Thank you so much for that introduction and for this opportunity to talk to everyone who's gathered here about writing history for kids. So, one reaction that I often get from kids, I do a lot of school sessions, I talk to students, I used to be a teacher. So, a reaction that I often get from kids is that history is boring. What's the point of studying history? It's happened in the past. Why do we need to know about it going forward? So, this is something that I think perhaps the group of us gathered here are not really going to relate to, because clearly we're here on a Saturday evening to talk about heritage and history. But it's true of a lot of adults that I've met as well, that this perception of history being boring, of their memories of history classes being a time for nap taking or gazing out of the window or daydreaming, is something that people seem to relate quite a lot. Even though history in other media, history as movies, history as video games, history in board games, all of those mediums through which history can be disseminated are things that people do take to in huge, with a great amount of gusto. So why is history class and why is reading about history considered so dull? So the way that I've sort of understood it from talking to a lot of kids is that it's really all about how history is taught in schools, and it's also about how history is presented to them in books written especially for them. Often in schools especially, there is this textbook and exam approach to history, one that is more about memorizing vast amounts of information, of reducing wars and conflicts and other events in history to lists of causes and consequences or reasons why something failed, to remembering dates and key facts, and not really about understanding the past or why understanding the past is even relevant to us anymore. When you reduce history to the regurgitation of information without that human story, without drama, without connection, you end up making it uninteresting. And another problem with a lot of children's books for history, on history, is that there is a certain lack of nuance or complexity. In children's books, there's a tendency to tell the same stories about the same people over and over in the same ways. We oversimplify and we remove nuance because that's what we think kids can handle. So, for instance, I'm going to talk a little bit about books on modern India, because that's where I've published, and that's the kind of that's the feedback I've gotten anytime I've talked to kids about the history of modern India. Books for kids on modern India, on the creation of India, on the freedom movement, tend to be about the political leaders. They tend to tell you a narrative that really removes all idea of conflict or precariousness. It removes the excitement, the newness of what was going on in the years prior to 1947. We talk about the movement in a way that makes it seem like everyone just fell in line once Gandhi took the helm, and that was that. And then there was the Dandi March, and then there was the Quit India movement, and then we got freedom from the British, and there was the Tryst with Destiny speech, and that was it. So we barely or rarely actually talk about personalities who clashed. So, for instance, people quitting the Congress to do different things. We don't talk about people like the socialist Jayaprakash Narayan, or we don't talk about people like J.B. Kripalani, people who disagreed with the Nehru and Gandhi vision of how the Congress should be. We don't even talk about people who were outside of the Congress-led independence movement. We don't talk about the disagreements within the leadership. So we don't really talk about how Nehru and Gandhi's relationship was. And we, for instance, we also don't talk about the fact that Gandhi, although he encouraged women to participate in the freedom movement, didn't want women to participate in the Dandi March because he was worried about violence. So why don't we talk about these complexities? Why don't we say, why don't we get into the nitty-gritty of these stories? The assumption that I've encountered is that children wouldn't understand or be interested in these things, which is not something that I agree with, but we'll come back to that. The other reason, and I think this is true generally of how a lot of people in India and elsewhere view history, is that we think about history as a source of inspiration. And we think about it as a source of a very particular kind of inspiration. We need our heroes to be uncomplicatedly good, and we need our villains to be uncomplicatedly bad. Whereas the past is really a lot more complicated than that, as we know as adults. And in India, there's actually been a wave of history writing for adults in the recent past by historians who are crafting narratives that are compelling, who are painting complex pictures of the past, peopled by characters who are complicated, who are black, white, and every shade of gray in between, who can be problematic, but who are these books, these stories about the past are asking us to be empathetic. Even though we may not necessarily understand why somebody did something, the effort to understand is there. It is being asked of us. But why don't we ask kids to do the same things? Why do we think kids can't take it? Why do we oversimplify and strip history of all nuance? That was the question that I started off with when I was asked to write this book about 75 notable Indians who shaped modern India. So I had to first figure out, what does modern India mean? What does shaping it mean? And why would I pick only 75? So when you start looking at those parameters, you start asking yourself, what is the point of writing this book? What do I want kids to know? And one big thing that I wanted to hold on to, one principle that I wanted to hold on to, was to never remove complexity, was to try and stay away from straightforward narratives of good versus evil, to make history interesting by complexifying it. Because when you think about it, isn't a heroic person more impressive, more heroic, when you think about them coming to that heroism through struggle? Aren't flawed people more compelling than completely perfect ones, simply because we can identify with them better and even see ourselves in them? So why shouldn't history for writing for kids focus on those things? Why shouldn't it show people in all their flaws, making mistakes and making decisions that impact millions of people? Why don't we try and teach kids to understand the whys and the hows behind the decisions that they've been impacted by? Why don't we? Because I do believe that having kids understand the complexities of the past could help them be more sympathetic, could help them be less likely to jump to a snap judgment about a person or perhaps even an entire community. In fact, if you really consider it, the stories that stay with us, whether about history or fictional stories, it's the story of someone struggling against their own demons, someone who succeeds despite the things thrown at them by the world, by their own families, by the circumstances that they're in. Those are the stories that we find worth sharing, the stories of people who overcome those struggles. So why shouldn't kids be able to see those struggles too, right? So if not oversimplification, if not simple black and white narratives, how do we write history for kids? How do we make history layered and complex and interesting, but still entertaining for young readers? So, two ideas that I kept coming back to, that I found useful and that I think would be good touchstones for history writing for kids, would be relatability and representation. So, what do I mean by relatability? Kids are often alienated by historical figures because there's very little that they feel they can relate to them with. There isn't much. And one particular pet peeve of mine in this regard is what I like to call the Gification of history. We often have the suffix G added to historical figures who we think ought to be put on pedestals. So we say Gandhi Ji, we say Pandit Ji, we add that sense of remoteness. We create a sense of distance between us and them. And the worst thing that I think is created by this Gification of history is the sense that they're above criticism and they're above us in some way. So when you talk about somebody like that to a child, and I speak from experience, for me, this Gification of history ended up making me feel like all of these people that I was reading about were just boring old uncles and aunties, and I had nothing to do with them. So there was no reason for me to really try and understand who they were. But when you get away from that, when you try to show kids people in their context, to show how people's childhoods and experiences shape them, you enable kids to empathize with these figures and then develop a deeper connection and just be more interested in them. So one way that I usually try to establish relatability is through both tone and content. So I stay very far away from trying to Gify people. If anything, I tend to err on the side of being absolutely objective. I like to present content in a way that allows kids to draw their own conclusions. I don't want to put my judgment of somebody or something onto them. I would like them to think about things on their own. So, for example, I avoid using a lot of adjectives to describe somebody. I avoid making value judgments because those are things that you want children to come to on their own. You want them to read about somebody's activities and you want them to say, hey, that seems like a good idea. That was a good thing that they did. Or you want to read about something that they did and that you might not agree with or you might find problematic. And you want a child to come to that conclusion on their own. The idea is to create content that allows kids to exercise their own critical thinking and judgment. Now, in terms of content, the thing that I think is most fun to do is, and a very easy trick, a very easy way to get kids to relate to historical figures is to talk about them as kids. So whenever I do school sessions and I talk to kids about modern India, I invariably show them this picture and I show them this picture, and they get such a kick out of seeing Gandhi as a little boy with a topi and seeing Nehru as a slightly older boy dressed like a young English gent. And they really love the idea of thinking about them. Nobody's ever asked them to think about Gandhi or Nehru as a young person, as a child who might have similar challenges to them. So, for instance, I talk a lot about how Gandhi was bad at school, how he was very shy. And this is something that kids have told me they really enjoyed. They liked knowing that Gandhi was once a little boy who had problems that they do. They also really enjoy hearing about the fact that Nehru was very worried about going bald at the young age of 21. And that was something that he actually wrote a letter about to his dad. So these sorts of problems where you're taking somebody who is notionally remote, who's talked about in their textbook as a G that they have to look up to, and you make them more human, that's one very quick and easy way that kids immediately sort of grab onto these people as real people that they can try to understand, even if they're not going to consciously articulate it that way. Now, the other thing about these sorts of stories is that they add a bit of humor to history. And I find that in India, especially, we tend to be quite resistant to humor in history. We don't want to look at history with any sort of irreverence. Rather, it's the opposite. We go in the direction of being too reverent, I would say. And so that is another way that you put kids off. Kids don't like to be preached to. They are very resistant to you telling them that this person is completely above criticism. And so if you've ever heard of it, there's this wonderful series called Horrible Histories, which covers much of British and European history. And it's hilarious because it is this collation of really funny, sometimes icky, sometimes gross facts about historical figures. And the fact that you can have that is incredibly popular with kids because of how it makes history funny and entertaining. And so that's one sort of approach that one might be able to take to Indian history to make it more relatable and entertaining for kids, which is something that I try to do, but it's hard given how political history can be. As I was saying earlier, you avoid a tone that is prescriptive and kind of imposes your judgment on somebody or something to a child. So I avoid talking about things as great achievements or using too many adjectives, injecting my opinion. Because whether somebody was great or not, whether something was great or not, is something you want the child or any reader really to come to an assessment of on their own. And as an author, my job is merely to tell you a good story. Your judgment, your relation with that character, all of that is coming from you as the reader. So the goal really, when I write history for kids, is to demystify historical figures, to enable kids to see that these people were children too, that they had flaws, that they could be fallible, which makes them that much more interesting to read about. The other big thing that kids love is fun facts. They like sharing little tidbits of information with each other. They like knowing odd or arcane facts about people. And so I just thought it would be fun for me to share some of the fun facts that I've included in this book and talk to kids about that they've, again, really gotten a kick out of. So The first one is actually not that fun. But Ambedkar, when he was a student at Columbia University in the US, was a huge collector of books. He loved books. And he amassed a collection of something like over 2,000 secondhand books when he was a student. And when he was preparing to come back to India, he decided to ship them back on well, by ship. But it being the middle of World War One, a German U-boat sadly sank the ship carrying his books, which is one of those facts that I bring out to at school sessions where kids are like, "Oh, no, all of those books just went to the bottom of the ocean." They're horrified by it, and they again, it's like immediately you feel this connection with somebody who you otherwise thought of as just the father of the Constitution. That's all you know about him. So that's one. Another one that always gets a lot of interest is the fact that Subhash Chandra Bose was expelled from Presidency College in Kolkata when he was a student because he got involved in a fracas with an English professor who was supposedly being racist. The story changes, but he got into a fight and then he got expelled. And now that's one thing that, again, kids are really interested by, that, oh, really? He could be a bad kid. He could have done something wrong. He could have broken rules. Similarly, there's a story that I don't often tell kids because I don't want to give them ideas, but there's a story of VP Menon, who at the age of 13 got into a conflict with his headmaster, I think over lack of attendance, and he burned his school down, and then he ran away from home. So again, facts like that, you have to be a little careful about sharing them with kids, not to give them ideas, but those are the sorts of things that immediately create a sort of bond across the last whatever 50, 70 years between this child in 2023 and somebody who lived that many years ago, who they think of as remote and inaccessible. And finally, there's also Vikram Sarabhai, who had, again, like a very interesting childhood, which kids love hearing about, which is that he was born into a family of 8 siblings, and his parents, being extremely wealthy industrialists, decided to start their own little Montessori school for them on their estate outside Ahmedabad. And all of these kids grew up in an environment very, very Sound of Music like, where they had access to tools and experimental like equipment for experiments. And in fact, this little train model and the engine is supposed to have been built by a young Vikram Sarabhai. So once again, a fact that kids are very fascinated by. And my final fact is about Morarji Desai, whose dietary preferences, the most notorious of which I will not get into. But this particular list of requirements was shared when he traveled to the Commonwealth Summit in 1979. And maybe I'll leave it up there for a couple of extra seconds so you can really enjoy it. The one that always gets a reaction is the 5 pieces of garlic freshly peeled before serving. And then a lot of kids are like, well, might not make him the best person to sit next to at lunch. So, but again, this sort of fun fact or slightly humorous approach that allows you to appreciate people as people with full lives, childhoods, passions, quirks. That's the approach to history that I think adults respond to, but equally kids do as well. And finally, the other big thing that I think works very well with kids and that I do a lot is to build narrative. In fact, in my book of 75 biographies, one of my great regrets is that I couldn't build as much of a narrative as I wanted to. But despite that, creating different sorts of stories for kids rather than just going good person did good things, had good consequences, is something that I feel quite strongly about and that I think kids respond to very well. So one type of narrative, the easiest one, is where you have someone who is unequivocally good working to do something that is of benefit to their communities. So the story of Gaura Devi, who spearheaded the incident in the Garhwal Hills in the village of Raini in 1973, that sort of kicked off the Chipko movement into high gear. The story goes that she was a widow. She was somebody who was very well respected in her community. And on a particular day, a sporting goods company to whom the forests around Rainey had been sold had sent in their loggers to cut the trees down. And there were no men or boys in the village on that day because, as luck would have it, they'd been called away to a local government office to collect some funds. And so the only person who of any authority who was around was Gora Devi. And a little girl supposedly spied the loggers arriving, ran to Gora Devi, told her about it, and she immediately swung into action, gathered up as many women and girls as she could, took them out to the trees, and the women and girls famously, of course, hugged the trees. And for hours, this standoff between the women and the loggers went on for hours and hours. There were guns, there were axes, but the women didn't budge. There was abuse, there was shouting, but in the end, the loggers had to give in and leave. Now, this is a great story, and it's one that's like a huge hit at every session I've done. Every time I tell it, I have a sea of spellbound kids listening to it because it's such a great story of a small person with limited power standing up to a big power and winning, which is like any great fantasy story has a similar plot line. So this is an easy story to tell kids to get them hooked. But what about something more complicated? What about someone like Indira Gandhi, who is a little bit harder to like, who is a little bit harder to create sympathy for? So one way of doing it that I found effective is to talk about her as a kid. So kids are very receptive to the idea that she grew up in this household where not a lot of people had much time for her. Not a lot of people had time to nurture her and give her the kind of attention that she wanted, the kind of attention that she perhaps deserved. And even they're very intrigued by this idea that she could have grown up in a household where every adult relative she had was involved in the independence movement, that there were people of great importance coming and going into her childhood home. There were times when she was pretty much by herself because everybody was in prison and there was no one to really look after her. So to think about, I often ask kids to think about that, growing up like that, with that kind of insecurity, and then growing up into somebody who is written off by people because she was a girl, who is thought of as unimportant because she's just somebody's daughter. So I often ask them to think about all of those circumstances, who she was, how she grew up, the kind of experiences that shaped her, losing her mother as a young person, and then ask them to think about her as a grown up. Once again, no judgment there. I'm not saying any one thing is good or bad, but kids automatically start to think about her with greater sympathy and to say, well, yeah, sure, she did bad things, but she was a person. You can look beyond that to try and understand who she was and why she did what she did. So things like that are very, like, it's just about complexifying the narrative, about making it more layered, about adding information to give kids a more well-rounded picture of who they're reading about. And then finally, the other sort of narrative that I often use is to talk about how people grow and change. Sometimes, like, as we've been saying, because we don't talk about Nehru's childhood, because we don't talk about how people have conflicts with each other, the kind of family life they had, because often books do not get into those kinds of details. We end up with this idea of historical figures as static people, people who didn't change, people who had one ideology, they stuck to it, they never deviated, never had any doubts, and they were great. But I ask kids to think about people who perhaps started off in one place and then ended up somewhere entirely different, like Salim Ali, who as a child went shooting and used an air rifle to shoot down birds. But then once, when he shot a bird, he picked it up, found that he couldn't identify it, and then he decided to go to the Bombay Natural History Society to show it to the head of the Natural History Society, who then identified the bird for him. And that one moment sparked a lifelong interest in ornithology and eventually made him somebody who single-handedly changed the face of ornithology and who shaped how conservation policy was made in India. So somebody who became nicknamed the Birdman of India, how you can grow from being someone who shoots birds to someone whose entire life is about safeguarding them. So that's another way of showing kids how people aren't always one thing. They change, they grow, they evolve, and it's okay. So, to come to the other point of representation, representation in my approach is just to to expand what kids learn about in school, to go beyond what they already know and try and change what they think about what they know. So this, of course, is a photograph of the Constituent Assembly of India. As we know, there were over 500 members, there were 15 women, and there were representatives from every religious community in India. However, it was still dominated by upper caste Hindu men, who are often the ones who are most likely to be talked about in a kid's book or in a textbook. So, but this is a great opportunity when you try to change that narrative, when you try to inject new life into it by talking about literally new lives. You have the opportunity to create a conversation starter, to talk to kids about things that are difficult or maybe sometimes considered inappropriate to talk to them about, which again, I don't necessarily agree with that, but to talk to kids simply about things like caste or class or religious and linguistic diversity, to expand what they think about India and what it means to be Indian. So we know that a lot, as I said, a lot of different people from different classes and castes joined the independence movement and were part of it and played a big role in it. But like I said, textbooks and popular writing for kids often focuses on either upper caste men with a few token women thrown in, like Sarojini Naidu, for example. But what about the hundreds and thousands of other people who played equally important roles alongside these big stars? That was a big question for me when I was writing this book. So, one of the things that I think we can do when we write history for kids is to tell stories that diversify their understanding of the past, that can create this opportunity to start conversations on diversity, on discrimination, on social change. And one way to do that is literally to just highlight people who are otherwise not given enough attention. So, for instance, someone like Dakshayani Velayudan is someone who's part of this book, and she was the only female Dalit member of the assembly. She was also, at age 34, the youngest member of the assembly, and she has a really interesting life story. She was born into a lower caste family in Kerala. The family that she was born into actually had a long history of participation in anti-caste movements, and Dakshayani was absolutely supported to go and get her education. She became the first scheduled caste woman to get a bachelor's degree in India, and she struggled through it because in there was all sorts of prejudice and discrimination that she had to face. Famously, she wasn't allowed to get too close to the instructor when they were performing experiments because her presence could be polluting. So I've put things like that into the book just to ask kids to think about the sort of experiences that someone who isn't them might have. And or somebody like Begum Qudsiya Aizaz Rasool, who was the only female Muslim to be part of the Constituent Assembly, who was originally a member of the Muslim League before she quit and joined the Congress, and who was elected to public office in the United Provinces in 1937, who at the time actually scandalized a lot of people by refusing to conform to the rules of Parda when she was in public office. And there was even this was such a big deal that there was a fatwa issued against her. And despite the fatwa, she was re-elected several times, and she held high office multiple times, right up to being a Rajya Sabha MP in the 1990s. So it's quite, to me, discovering people like this was a big deal, because I think as a child I didn't know that there were so many people involved. I'd never had access to information about people like this, or even someone like Jaipal Singh Munda, who was a member of the Munda tribe, who was educated by missionaries who sent him to England, and who eventually studied economics at the University of Oxford. He was a talented hockey player who actually captained India's gold medal winning team at the 1928 Olympics. And when he returned to India, he led the Adivasi Mahasabha and was elected to the Constituent Assembly as an independent candidate, where he was extremely influential in securing land rights for tribal communities across India. And then again, you've got people from the margins who are contributing in material ways. But then the other thing that I found fascinating during the course of researching this book was how much resistance there was to one singular idea of India. So somebody like C.N. Annadurai, who was a Dravidian leader, who was actually a separatist, who advocated a separate state for Tamilians for quite a long time into the 1950s, and who was a big advocate of regional pride, of Tamil pride in terms of avoiding the imposition of a singular language. And one of the things that I find really problematic in some ways about history writing for kids is that we tend to focus a lot on the result of what happened. We tend to focus a lot on, oh, India was created at this point in time, 15th August 1947. India won freedom. There was one country, unity in diversity. Everybody was happy. That's it. We never talk too much about the linguistic separatist movements. Like, for instance, I know that one of the Khaki talks that Amrita was talking about was about had the Samyukta Maharashtra movement featured in it. So none of those sort of pushes for regional identity, the push and pull of different communities within India, of the way in which diversity plays out, kids are not often taught about it. And in fact, for me, when I was researching this book, is the first time that I encountered how much negotiation, how much conversation, how much back and forth went on between different groups. And it gives you a completely different sense of the country that you live in, not in a way that is bad. It's in a way that makes you feel pretty good about the fact that so many people with so many different interests could come together and keep this up for so long. And it feels like an important thing that kids should know about. So I do talk a lot about the linguistic separatist movements. I do talk about separatist movements in the Northeast as well, where I feel it's important for kids to know that things are not hunky-dory all the time. And again, the other thing that I should come to, since we've gotten into politics quite a lot, is that it's also important to go beyond just the political or activist paradigm. So I've talked a little bit about people like J.R.D. Tata, who was somebody who grew up outside of India, but then came back to India, gave up his French citizenship, and converted his, of course, again, famously converted his childhood passion for flying to creating a viable commercial airline in India. But more interestingly, about Tata himself was the Bombay Plan, which was something that I had no idea about until I was writing this book, where it was a group of industrialists who came together to put together a plan that essentially laid out a methodology or a set of measures in which industrialists and the government could work together to boost India's economy, to increase manufacturing, to invest in heavy industry. But most interestingly, it also had quite a lot of money earmarked for social causes, for welfare measures, for education, which itself, I think, again, gives kids a sense of a different kind of industrialist, a different kind of era, a different kind of group of people where everybody was sort of invested in building something together, which I think is quite different from the reality that they might encounter today. I also wanted to say a little bit about a couple of other people who are featured in the book, to just to give you a sense of the kind of what I mean by representation, what I mean by diversity. So someone like Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, who was born in Mangalore, lost her husband when she was very, very young, and who was a big advocate of women's rights, and who was incidentally married to Harindranath Chattopadhyay, who was Sarojini Naidu's brother, and who, along with Sarojini Naidu, was one of the women who pushed back against Gandhi's dictum that women shouldn't be part of the Dandi March. In fact, she went to Chowpatty Beach and made salt there. And she was also responsible for the preservation of traditional manufacturing methods and handicrafts in India as a way of reclaiming and honoring these traditional arts that had been slowly losing importance, losing their status under the British. And somebody like her, it's interesting for kids, I think, to see that you can build a nation, you can be of use, even if you're not out there marching on the streets. Although she did, but I'm focusing more on her cultural contributions. So you can still be someone who does something. It's not just about diversity of people, but about diversity of contributions, diversity of occupations that people could have. Because I think, again, in India, we tend to narrow the vision of what a child sees around them. We tend to create narratives that give them very simplistic ideas about what they could be in the future. For example, like, you be a doctor, be an engineer. Where is the complexity beyond that? Where are the other avenues that people could take? So one way of kind of pushing back against that in writing history is just to say, look, we've always had people do different things. We've always had people choose different paths, which brings me very nicely to MS Subbulakshmi, the iconic Carnatic singer whose mother was a Devadasi, who left home at 20 because she didn't want to marry the person her mother chose for her, and whose voice subsequently became ubiquitous in homes across India, and who again came to represent a particular kind of India abroad, including at the UN in 1966. So by showcasing people who did different things, I feel by writing history for kids, where you expand it beyond the usual suspects, you give people a sense, you give kids really a sense that you can be important, you can be useful, you can be constructive in a variety of different ways. You don't have to be just one thing. Now, why are, like I said, why would you want to do that? Why would kids need to know those things? One, of course, because it gives kids something new to read about, someone new to find out about, something that's beyond Nehru, Gandhi, Patel. But also, each of these stories, the way that I approach them, the way that I talk about them in the book, it is always about complicating what we know about people. So, for instance, with Kamla Devi, I include the detail that she got divorced at a time when divorce was not common. I include the detail that J.R.D. Tata couldn't take up his studies at Cambridge and he lost his dad young. I include the detail that Annadurai wanted a separate Dravida Nadu. Why would you include those bits of information? Or even that MS Subbulakshmi was a Devadasi. Why include things that might confuse, or that people might think would confuse, or not be understood by kids? Because I think kids do understand these things. They do want to know these things. They want to know about people as people. They want to know the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's okay. I think to a certain extent, there is a tendency to wrap things up in cotton wool, and that also contributes to why we write history for kids in such a boring or unimaginative way. It's because we think kids can't take it. But usually, and especially today, given kids' access to the internet and information, there is a lot of curiosity about the world, curiosity about people. And one other reason to share details like this is to normalize what might otherwise be talked of as abnormal to kids. It's okay. It's okay to talk about divorce. It's okay to talk about somebody not being able to go to college. It's okay to talk about someone coming from a single parent household. When you go back in the past and you say it was there 100 years ago, it was there 75 years ago, you make it more normal, you make it more acceptable, you make it more unremarkable. And I think that's a really important part of any writing for kids, that you show them that prejudice or stereotyping have no basis in reality. These things have always happened. Now, there are other issues that I haven't had the opportunity to talk about with regard to this particular book that I wrote, but I am working on another book which brings up some of these issues, such as sex and violence. Like we were just saying, like, how do you talk about things that might be controversial? It depends very much on the age group. it depends very much on what you think is acceptable and what you think isn't acceptable. But for instance, this particular image is a manuscript illumination of the Second Battle of Panipat, where Akbar defeated the general Hemu. So when I showed it to a kid, I didn't realize that it had severed heads. And of course, the child immediately looked at the severed heads and was immediately extremely fascinated by the severed heads. But how do you decide? Like, kids do love gore, kids do love the icky details of history. So to what extent do you gratify that desire to know about the icky details, and to what extent do you hold back? That's something that changes from period to period. And the other thing that I haven't really had the chance to get into in great detail, because again it didn't apply to this particular book, was the role of art and design. Art and design make history books really engaging to a degree that I think is absolutely valuable. So when I was a kid, I loved books like that. I loved books that had these kinds of look inside a house, or boxes and bits of information. Art and design can be really, really valuable in making kids very interested in history and taking them back. The further back in time you're talking about, the more art and illustration, design, and these kinds of like imaginative leaps help kids to actually see these times and places and people as interesting. And I mean, historical fiction versus nonfiction, that is a huge question. Historical fiction is something that is written a lot for kids in India. It is often very, very well written. Sometimes it's not, but it can be something that goes beyond the nonfiction. You know, it allows you to get inside the head of a character, but it does require certain imaginative leaps. I write primarily nonfiction, but I think even within nonfiction, it's possible, like I said, to create a narrative. It's possible to create history that is interesting, that is fascinating, and that is itself an argument for why history is something that you would want to learn about. I thought I would just finish with a little bit of the way that I conclude my sessions when I talk to kids about history, and it's something that I feel is very important, especially when it's a book about 75 incredible Indians who shaped modern India. You know, so when you talk about people like this, when you present their achievements, you really often you only talk about the good. It's like when you win a prize or you do really well in an exam, later on you only remember the achievement. You don't remember feeling annoyed, you don't remember feeling discouraged, you don't remember feeling disappointed, you don't remember feeling tired. I never want kids to leave my sessions or to read my books thinking that the people that they read about were all saints, or that they never had a bad day. They did. They had lots of bad days, and they had lots of flaws, and they were not perfect, and they made mistakes. But that's why they were interesting, and that's why they're still worth reading about today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ashvi. That was such an interesting session posted here. First of all, Sharda says that you brought in a very interesting perspective with the Giification by putting people in the, in the position of a godlike pedestal. So it feels like what they did was always correct and therefore not to be questioned. By removing that, you're allowing us to question their actions and see, okay, maybe it was good, maybe it was bad, and maybe it was just good for the times, and maybe it is not relevant anymore today, but you're really bringing people as equal. Do you have anything more to say for that?
Yeah, I agree. I think for me it was a very personal issue, you know, because I grew up thinking about modern Indian history as incredibly dull because of the Giification. I didn't care for simply reading about old men doing things. And when I started reading about Gandhi as a young person, when I started reading about Nehru as a young person in at university, when I started reading about, say, Amrit Kaur and the struggles that she had in trying to, because she wanted to be part of the independence movement, but she wasn't able to because her parents wouldn't allow her. The more you read about these people as people, the more you feel connected to them, the more you feel it is less about judging them, it is less about condemning them, it's less about celebrating them, it's more about just I almost felt like I understood what it meant to be like a citizen of India better because I understood them better. And that, I think, was for me the most valuable thing. It was just I didn't value this part of my identity very much before, and because I understood the kind of struggle, the difficulties, the bad times, the good times, the highs and the lows of people, it helped me value this more. And yeah, that's all I have to say.
Sharda also asks you, in all your research, which historical figure has left you gobsmacked by their human or not so human side, and something that you didn't know at all?
Ooh, well, this is going to be a cliche answer, but I really, the person that I think I discovered the most about and who I was the most impressed with was Jawaharlal Nehru, who I did not really think much about before, but who is someone that I developed a great liking and admiration for through the course of reading about his life. Because I think there's this lovely story of how there was once an article published in a magazine that was extremely critical, like really, really harshly critical of Nehru, made a lot of fun of him, talked about him as being someone who was an autocratic, bad tempered person, and who just was, it was, like very harsh criticism. And later it was found out that Nehru had written the article about himself. And it was just that moment when I read that, it was just this I felt such a kinship, because I really appreciate the degree of self-awareness that he had to write that about himself and to put it out there. And I found that someone who could be that person, who could be that self-aware and that capable of laughing at himself, I found it a really endearing quality. And a lot on top of all of the hard work, the being, having 18-hour work days, etc., etc., like on top of the work ethic, on top of the intelligence of the man, it was that self-awareness and that ability to laugh at himself that I found really just it's stuck with me ever since I finished writing the book.
Okay, I'm going to flip the next two questions. Somebody's first, first tell us the name of the book that you've written, because I think that hasn't come out clearly. And also tell us the age group that can read it. This is Vidhi's question.
Okay. The name of the book is Incredible Indians, 75 People Who Shaped Modern India. It is meant for kids aged 10 or 11 and up.
Okay. And now Anvesha's question, who says, can you reflect, so 75 people, and therefore you've done a selection of 75 individuals. Can you reflect on the logic of who you selected, and more importantly, who you omitted from this list?
Okay. It's a good question, because funnily enough, I originally started off with a list of like 150 people, and whittling it down to 75 was an extremely painful process because it felt wrong to exclude so many people. And one of the things, actually, one of the discussions I had with the publisher early on was, do we really need to include Nehru, Gandhi, Patel, and a couple of other people like Vikram Sarabhai, Homi Bhabha? These people have books about them. They're talked about ad nauseum elsewhere. Do I need to include them? And the publisher said, well, yeah, if you're going to put in 75 incredible Indians who shaped modern India, you can't exclude them because there will be anger and riots. You can't possibly leave them out. So I do think that part of my selection process was determined by what I thought people might expect. And the other thing is, because it's for kids age 10 and up, they're not necessarily coming to this with a lot of knowledge. Like they're not necessarily, like, I think of Nehru and Gandhi as cliches, but a 10-year-old may not. So I tried to find ways to mitigate their inclusion by putting in interesting information about them that they might not find elsewhere. But in terms of who I included and who I didn't, the inclusion was very much determined by the structure of the book. So the book like I said, I didn't want it to be just about the independence movement, even though pretty much everybody who was anybody seemed to be involved in it at the time. Um, I didn't want it to be just about that. So I have divided the book up into sections that talk about, say, military men. There are sections that talk about literary marvels. So people like Mulk Raj Anand are included, Mahashweta Devi is included. I've talked about environmentalists. I've talked about people like PC Mahalanobis. I've talked about Sukumar Sen. I've talked about people who help to like. First of all, the question was, who is a shaper of modern India? What do we mean by shaping modern India? So for me, it was more than political. It was about how do we build institutions to create a country from scratch, pretty much. So that decided how I selected people. And the thing was, even then, it was quite difficult. So at the back of the book, I have this little section that's called Other Incredible Indians, which just has people who I had to leave out and who are there just in portrait form. One person that I did, it was a controversial choice, but I did at one point want to include Muhammad Ali Jinnah, because I think when you think about shaping modern India, he definitely had a role in shaping it by demanding Pakistan. So it was something that I was toying with at the time, because I thought, well, yeah, he did have a big role in shaping literally the borders of modern India, but I eventually didn't include him because I thought that might be a step too far.
So maybe there'll be a book too, which talks about those that you left out. Pradipti would like to know if you could talk about the language of writing for children, especially history.
That's another good question, because one of the challenges I faced when writing this book was, what how do I decide what a child knows? So for example, I called Jayaprakash Narayan a socialist. Now I know what a socialist is, you know what a socialist is. Does a 10-year-old know? And would they even understand if I tried to explain it to them? So I had to figure out, like, there were certain things. I even talked about EMS Nambudripad, who was the chief minister of the first democratically elected communist government, right? So even there, I had to again explain what communism was. Why did it matter? So what we had to do was to try and put in, like, we put in boxes that would explain these terms in child-friendly ways. And the other thing is, like I was saying, one of the things that I was very conscious about was to avoid judgment, avoid putting my opinion on a child, but also avoid talking down to kids. This is another one of my big pet peeves. I hate when books for kids talk down to them, because kids are really not stupid. They're very, very smart. Every school session I've done, even grade 4 children know so much that I feel kind of underprepared talking to them. They're so clever, they're so knowledgeable. Talking down to them is never going to endear yourself to them. So that was one thing I was very clear about. I am not going to go, chalo children, let me tell you about what Gandhi ji did today. I did not want to do that. So tone was very important to me. And language wise, I just kept it simple. I like, even an adult could read this book and enjoy it. They would not feel talked down to. And a child could read this book and enjoy it and feel like they're getting information, but not in an overwhelming or alienating sort of way.
Rohini says that's a wonderful talk, and so does P. Venkataraman. Vidhi says
Thank you.
that it was a beautiful talk, loves history, and now she wants to share it with her daughter who's just turned 7, maybe just the right time to start telling her about history and what's brought us here. Ashish says, thank you very much for an innovative way in which to express a topic, especially history, not an easy thing to do. I did like the point where you talked about, the boat, the World War II sinking the boats of which were carrying the books for Ambedkar. And really, something like that is not just not just gives you a view of him as a man who lost something, or the books were lost, but also what great placement in history. Because my personal feeling is that we all learn history in little nuggets, and you learn about something that happened in India and you learn about something that happened in the US, but you really don't have a spatial sort of setting of saying that these things were happening at the same time in the two countries. So information and trivia like that, and really nuggets like that, really put those events together in the minds of children.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, because that was another thing that was really important to me. Because a lot of the people that you read about in the book, which was actually surprising to me, is a lot of the people you read about were involved in politics outside of India. So a lot of them were part of political outfits, say in London, that were agitating for Indian independence. There were people who were involved in political activities, again, agitating for Indian independence, but in Germany, in Switzerland, across Europe. It was really fascinating. In fact, one of the stories that didn't make it into the book was about a brother of Sarojini Naidu's, who was involved in a revolutionary group, who was exiled to Germany, who traveled to Russia, and eventually died in a Stalinist camp. So it at that time, it, again, like you say, we don't look at Indian history as part of global history, which I think is a big problem, because Indians have always been part of global history. From centuries ago, we have been enmeshed in global networks of trade, of politics, of war for centuries, and we've reacted to things happening across the globe in so many ways. And I think that's something that I'm trying to do a little bit more of in my next book. But that's such a good point. I really wanted the book, like the way that I've talked about people's childhoods and education and travel, I wanted that to be a subtle way of showing kids that we were part of a global economy for a long time before liberalization. We were just there.
C. Ladad asks, how do we emphasize the relevance of reading or learning of history first? Most of the times we get the question, why do I need to know? Why do I need to know this now? How do you make history relevant?
Good question. It's one that I've never had to answer for myself, because I just love it. But I think the way to make to get kids to understand, and it is a question that kids I've met have asked me. They're like, it happened in the past, miss, why do we need to know? So my answer to them is that, well, read a little bit, listen to me talk, read this book, read other books about history, and then tell me if you think it's absolutely irrelevant. And I know that sounds like a little bit of a cop out, but the way, like I said, the argument for history's relevance is the way that we share history with kids itself. I think if we make it interesting, if we talk about it in terms of, oh, like, so one thing recently that struck me was, yeah, so we had a Bharat Jodo Yatra, but there was another Bharat Jodo Yatra back in the 1980s that was started by somebody called Baba Amte, who was an activist. So even something like connecting what kids see today to what was going on 75 years ago, 85 years ago, 100 years ago, that's one way to very easily show them its relevance. And in India today, I feel like history has a unique relevance. We are always talking about history, we're always fighting about history. In some ways, I think a lot of us are too interested in history, in dredging up the past. So um, it's just about making history interesting. I think just the way you deliver it, the way you talk to kids about it, it will make its own relevance clear.
Thank you. Shefali says, thank you. This was a wonderfully stimulating and thought-provoking talk, and she looks forward to your next books. Ashish as well, and so does Anita here, say enjoying listening about a wide range of facets about our leaders and others, because really such information about people that we think we know very well and are so relevant to the history that we read, but not knowing that is and finding out is a great experience. Vidhi wants to know if we can recommend any book on developing a love for history for 7-year-olds.
There is a series for well, honestly, books like this sort of like very heavily illustrated um like introductory book. I don't know if you can see it clearly, but these kinds of books, these Osborne starting point history kind of books, they're great for very young kids, because they're visually led. So they've got lots of pictures for kids to be engaged by. And the information is delivered in sort of bite-sized nuggets. So the kind of fun fact approach I was telling you about, a lot of these books take that. And that, as a kid, as a 7-year-old, I loved those books. That's what I turned to. So I think that may be a good way to go for someone who's that young.
And it's amazing how much information children pick up from books like this. Like you said, children see those severed heads. I've really seen children memorize or learn what's written in the text without reading it by just making out what is there in the imagery with so much detail. We
Yeah.
adults probably tend to just skip that image because we read that thing and we think it's depicting that, but they see so much more. So a picture really speaks 1,000 words. Pradeep says that history is such a contested space. How do you prevent your politics from informing your decision to pick people to write about and what you write about them? I think it's a very relevant and topical question.
Well, again, yeah, that is a question that I had to ask myself a lot when I was writing this book, because my politics are invariably going to influence how I judge people, but I didn't want that to be something that informed the direction in which I took the book. So, for instance, I have so I was okay. So I can give you an example from my personal experience where I went into the book not knowing very much about somebody like Atal Bihari Vajpayee, whose politics and mine are not really on the same track at all. But by the end of researching his life, I had developed a sort of weird fondness for him because he seemed like such an interesting person. He was somebody who had a great deal of respect for people on the other side as well. There's again like a really good story, which because of the format of the book, I couldn't put all the good stories, like all the good stories I found in. But there was this lovely story about how when he was elected into as an MP, and when he became prime minister, he walked into his office and he saw that a portrait of Nehru that used to hang on the wall had been removed. And he asked some aide, like, where is the portrait? Why is it gone? And the aide said, oh, well, we thought you wouldn't want it here. And he said, no, why wouldn't I want it here? Put it back. And so just the fact that that somebody whose politics you don't agree with could be someone who is still worthy of respect, like that was a learning experience for me. So I also included Shama Prasad Mukherjee, who is one of those who started the Janata Party, which then became the BJP. And again, somebody whose politics or whose approach to or whose idea of India would not accord with what I think India is. But I put him in there because I again thought he was an interesting person, and he did certainly shape modern India. So one way that that really helped me keep my politics out of it was to focus in on the idea of people who shaped modern India. Shaping in itself is not necessarily an act that is political in one way or the other. You're shaping, you're contributing to creating a certain idea, and multiple ideas have come together to create what we think of as India today. And I wanted to do justice to that and therefore include people across the political spectrum and put them all in there.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think just by shaping, you're moving away, you're sort of removing the bias. It's an interesting perspective. Kathroli wants to know how you craft your content, and history is all about facts. So how do you add your essence to the fact to make the content interesting to the readers?
I think a lot of it has to do with tone, and I think again, like this particular book, if I can show you, it's quite the formatting is quite rigid. So each person gets either an entire spread like this or they get one little paragraph. So for this particular book that I was writing, which was intended to be sort of encyclopedic in nature, I had to focus on keeping things crisp, keeping things succinct, and trying to give the maximum amount of information in the least amount of words. But sometimes, like I'm working on another book right now where I'm focusing a lot more on the narrative, where it's very much about how I take the facts and weave them into a compelling story, which doesn't mean I'm making them fictional. I always have to like try and hold back from, like, there is a line between historical fiction and nonfiction. And you can have nonfiction that is narrative. You can have nonfiction that narrates the details of, say, this battle of Panipat, the picture that I showed. You can have a narrative that details the like a siege. You can have a narrative that details how a battle took place. You can still make it dramatic. You can still describe it in a narrative way, but you are still basing it on what are reported facts. You are still basing it on what we know from primary sources, from things that people wrote down at the time. So that is where I think my job as a history writer comes in. How do I take that material and create a fun story for you to read? How do I make you want to keep reading sentence after sentence? Because I think with textbooks, you have to read sentence after sentence. You're compelled to do it. But for me, I want to be compelling because I want you to be excited about reading it. And that comes from me knowing how to tell a good story.
Lots of compliments coming your way, Ashwitha, for a very articulate and insightful talk. And we will have to hear you again in the future. Himaja has a question, and I think we'll keep it as the last one. If a 14-year-old wants to start understanding history and political science from scratch, how can they do it and form their own opinion and not have to agree to others?
Well, I would say first of all, that they should try and read things that are objective, that don't come from a particular ideological stripe. So, for instance, my book. But apart from that shameless plugging of my book, I would say that it's good for you. Like at 14, for instance, I went into a history class where I had a teacher. It really came from my teacher, where they drilled it into me that history is not about one particular narrative. History is something that we understand through a variety of different sources, and different sources are created by different people for different purposes. So if I'm a courtier in Akbar's court and I'm writing a chronicle about him, inevitably I'm going to talk about him with great enthusiasm, right? Or if I'm and to take Akbar as an example, there was actually a courtier in his court who wrote a secret history that was outside, that was not published at all, that was not available for consumption during the time that it was written, because it was extremely critical of the emperor, and it would have been problematic for that courtier if that particular manuscript had been disseminated to anybody outside of just himself and perhaps a trusted friend. So one thing that I think you could do is to talk to your kid about how history is not about X happened, then Y happened, then Z happened. It's about a multiplicity of different stories about what happened in the past, and you read them and you come to a certain conclusion. It's very much about critical thinking. It's very much about trying to understand what people wrote, why they wrote it, and how we can grasp truth or meaning from it.
Okay. I did say that was the last question, but there's another one from Puffin who says, if you could give top 5 tips to people who are writing English textbooks catering to India's education system, what would they be? Be mindful of the diversity of readership, class, caste, etc.
I would say, if people are writing textbooks, I wish people would hire me to write textbooks. It would be fun. But I think the main thing would be we do have a problem in India of history textbooks becoming political battlegrounds. We do have an issue where over the last many decades, this is not new, and it's true not just of India but of many countries around the world. The way that history is taught to kids becomes extremely politicized. So the number one tip I would have is try and find people who will not politicize history, make decisions that are not based on politics but that are based on teaching kids how to think critically. The biggest favor that anybody ever did me as far as history teaching goes was to teach me about sources and teach me to think critically about who writes history and why it's written. And once you kind of instill that in a kid, you instill that in a student at age 14 or age 10 or age 12, that's something that never goes away, and they're always going to be critical. They're always going to read every history book, every source they find, every primary source they find, with a critical eye. And that I think is crucial. So if that's something, I would say, if our history books were able to talk about the method of history and talk about how we know what we know about the past, that would be like primary. I would say that's the most important thing we need to put into history textbooks.
Maria wants to know do you know of youngsters who read history as light reading because it's normally just restricted to schoolwork?
Yeah, surprisingly, I've met a fair number of kids who are very into history. But you know, the interesting thing is a lot of them are not interested in Indian history. And it makes me a little sad because that's how I used to be. I, as a kid, was not interested in Indian history. That's why I went and did a degree in British and European medieval history, because I found British history to be absolutely fascinating. And it really is because they know how to package their history. They create interesting books, they create funny books, they create books with beautiful illustrations, and they draw you in. I was obsessed with things like knights, I was obsessed with like tournaments. I loved the idea of these like crazy castles with secret passages and betrayals and backstabbings and all of that stuff, like the stuff that makes Game of Thrones, for example, which is not history, but based on an idea of history, so compelling. And I think I do know kids who read history, but they read not Indian history. They read like they're interested in World War I. They're interested in like the history of the Americas. They're not interested in Indian history because we're not doing it justice when it comes to writing it for kids. And I think like there are people who are trying to change it, and hopefully I am one of those people. But the more we do that, the more kids we'll find who will want to read history as light reading.
And there's enough of the backstabbing and secret passages and
Plenty.
fancy stuff like that in the Indian history as well.
Absolutely.
Vivo says that I wish they select you to write school history notebooks with NEP coming in and critical thinking. Right now, the books are too antiseptic and linear. And on that note and that wish for you to write books which children love to read, thank you very much, Ashwitha, for being here this evening. And thank you to everyone who else who's joined us this Saturday evening. And see you again next week.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fantastic. I hope I was able to talk a little bit of, or just to explain a little bit about how history can be really exciting and fun for young readers as well.